Hi, I'm Tom Ferguson. I'm the INET Director of Research, and with me is Professor Marcello de Cecco, one of the world's most eminent economic historians. And so welcome, Professor de Cecco.
Thank you.
All right, now maybe Marcello, whom I confess I have known for many years. You're probably best known for your book Money and Empire, although everyone knows lots of other articles and pieces you've written in many languages. I think maybe we should start with that. I guess I'd formulate the first question this way. Most images of the gold standard era treat it as a relatively stable system that unfortunately was interrupted by World War I. Your account of the gold standard is very different. Could we say you treat it as quite clearly something that was actually breaking down and developing in time? Could we talk a bit about that? How would you characterize the gold standard, first in general, and then maybe we could talk about its periodization?
Well, gold standard is called the gold standard, and we will keep calling it the gold standard. But it would be more relevant and precise to refer to it as the international monetary system between 1870 and 1914. And maybe that way it is defined in a way that you can see it links directly to what happened afterwards and what went on before those dates. But it is true that between those two dates there was something characteristic, more slightly different from before. But it was, as you said, having read the book, that which, by the way, is about 40, well, it came out in 1974, so it's 40.
Don't remind me.
It's for now. Anyway, a story that I try to tell there is a story of development, as you were correctly intimating before, of continuous change, and of, however, the domination by Great Britain of the international monetary system when the industrial supremacy of Britain had already finished. Because as we know, 1870 is about the date that is normally assigned to the beginning of the decline of Great Britain, which by 1914 was completely, especially at the hands of Germany and the United States, but also other people, as it were, other countries that started industrializing in earnest in that period. And then France had made an eclipse and a comeback within the span of the disappearance of 1870 because of the defeat by Prussia, and then the reappearance because the French were still incredibly rich and they generated a lot of savings up to and later than the First World War. So this was a developing system, a changing system, which, however, it's remarkable for the capacity by Britain to control some of it until much later than one thought. That's what is remarkable. Not the fact that then it was always prone to crisis and it was always on the verge of not being there any longer, and that finally with the war it wasn't there any longer, and when it was rebuilt after the First World War it didn't really function very well. But it wasn't functioning very well immediately before the First World War. People may say because we were going towards a war. The last 10 years between the defeat of the Boer War and the beginning of the First World War were years of great movement. They were not years of peace. They were years of peace, yes. But everybody was moving.
Could we talk about that a bit? Want to spell that out a bit more? I mean, what's the move? How do we know this system is getting more unstable? What you count as sort of good evidence on it, and you know,
there are two elements one could consider. One is the frequency of crisis. Then, of course, if you're a serious economist, you say yes. But you know, when you have a war like the Boer War, what do you expect? The crisis is going to be there with the international money. It normally happens like that, but then it goes back. But then it doesn't go back to normal. And the second element, which is immediate after that, is with the first one, is that you have continually to intervene on the part of the organizer of the system, of the conductor of the international orchestra.
this is bank rate and a.
No.
How
Bank
else?
rate is
Can you
the
spell
way.
out the tools?
Bank rate is the way the system functions. You change bank rate when, well, according to the union, say, principles. But then other things. You have to use other implements, other instruments, like, for instance, control of gold reserves by the so-called gold devices, which of course are not bank rate.
Right.
And also by the fact that the bank rate keeps oscillating. It's capable of going up to the sky and coming back, and it does what we have seen recently happening, that is to say, interest rates first of all going to the sky and then precipitated to the ground. And the same thing happens in those days. And people say, yes, but what does it matter? That moves and the rest doesn't move. And that is exactly the way it should be. But it isn't like that, because the rest moves. Because, for instance, the alignment of powers vis-à-vis banking, international banking and national banking, keeps changing. You know, the Americans developed exactly in that period an incredibly strange banking system. It's nothing new for the United States, but it is the way they were born. Why? Because they were invented as a country that used savings for investment. They never saved very much. They always invested more because they were an incredibly fast-growing country. It's, you know, we talk about China, but the United States in the second half of the 19th century China was nothing compared to the United States. Also because it's not the usual story of millions of peasants and then a bourgeoisie and then an upper class. No, the United States were all the best people in Europe, basically, emigrating. Of course, you had the scoundrels, you had the good-for-nothing, but mostly they were people who could use their hands and their brain. And they were the elite of the workforce of the places they left, in spite of what some people want to say, including the United States with the Statue of Liberty, is calm and dispossessed of the world. Yes, they were dispossessed because they weren't treated very well where they came from, but because it's easy, you know, the Italian peasants came to the US and earned 20 times as much. Any idiot would cross the Atlantic who could swim, more or less, at those rates. You know, can you imagine now? Suppose it was true, and it is true for the Vietnam, you know, or the Ecuadorians. They come in droves, and you still take them. That is remarkable, and it was remarkable from the start that controlling the incoming population in the States was never very effective. They even didn't want it. But also, they could manage to control the money that came in, because it came in basically from Britain, but it came in from the whole world. And the banks were invented in the most inventive way. They were made in order to lend, not to get, as we had. Our banks basically are to, you know, increase savings, look after savings. No, the American banks were invented to invest without having saved, which is the principle of banking, after all. In spite of what some economists want to tell us, banking is subversive exactly for that reason. because it makes you capable of investing without having saved.
Now, that's, yes, what might be called the sort of Keynesian or post-Keynesian account of investment and savings. The Americans sort of realized long before anybody theorized it.
They did it.
That,
more than talking about it, they did it.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the gold standard's functioning itself. I have heard you in some discussions we've had suggest maybe that the bank rate didn't work well in the last 10 years, and in some sense appeals to the devices are precisely that. But is that a fair characterization of how you think that?
Well, it is true because, as some Belgian banker politician said at the time, gold had become a prisoner of war, but everywhere. But war was not there.
Right.
So it was a prisoner of the war to come. It was part of the rearmament or armaments race, arms race, that went on exactly in that period.
Dreadnoughts, oil, and gold.
And gold. You amassed them.
Yeah.
You tried to be ready for the war that was inevitable. It wasn't clear between who and who. That is the tragedy of the First World War. But there was going to be a European war.
Yeah.
And so everybody amassed the what are they called? The
precautionary reserves?
The necessaries for war.
Okay.
Including the gold reserves. Why gold? The interesting thing is that one of the characteristics of the pre-war gold standard is that it had become a gold exchange standard, that is to say that reserves were kept by some people in some monetary centers in other things, in francs or so on, and that the central banks exchanged deposits between themselves. But then, in the last 10 years of the story, it reverted to a pure gold standard, exactly for the lack of trust, for the fact that if there was a war, you might have had the 220 billions in a central bank outside the country, but they would stop it. They say, no, we can't pay, sorry. That's what happened.
Well.
In 1 day, 2 days, July 1914, the whole world stopped. Reminds you of 2009, 8, 7.
Sure. Given that we're doing this in July 2014, we might come back to that in a minute. But before we get to that, maybe we can back up a bit. I mean, even if I could I know you think about the earlier stages of the gold standard, and particularly, the traditional story, well, the British get on it and then other people fall in. How about that development between the return to gold in Britain after the Napoleonic Wars down to 1870? There were a lot of crises. I'm curious how you see that, because when I read your stuff, if you do what the French call the lecture symptomatique, I can see very plainly you've got some kind of theory of categorization or a developing set of crises even before 1870. What's the 1859 crisis? The 60, sorry.
66.
Yeah, 66 is yes, and you're
and then before.
Yeah, just can we get
every 10 years?
Tell us a bit more, if you would.
Well, that is the idea, in fact, that when the normal rendering of this story is that the British start with the gold standard, they return to gold. Well, they incidentally find the gold standard in the 18th century. Then there is the story of the great Newton being master of the mint who establishes the parity and all this other, say, folklore, which is true, true folklore. But then the main story unfolds after the Napoleonic Wars, and when the British, either 16 or 19, depends, 1816 or 1819, depending on what act do you consider more important, go back to a gold standard, to freely exchanging gold upon request, and at a fixed price. And the story is that they stay there by themselves with a few more. Portugal, for instance, which is the oldest, say, ally and so on. But then there are, because of industrialization and the rise of the United States, crises, mostly transatlantic crises, every 10 years. And Marx, for instance, talks extensively on that, of that. But this is a characterization which is important because it shows the world as having cycles every 10 years. And for reasons that really escape my understanding, there has been another rendering of the story that says that as countries converge towards the gold standard, more and more adopt it, then the world becomes stabler. That is not true, as we were saying. But the period between 1519, the early 20s of the 19th century, and actual, say, the crisis of 66, and then 70 because of the war in France and between France and Prussia, then that period is the period of the real industrial revolution, also on the continent. It expands. The beginning of the German industrialization, and the French, of course, being there in great style, being the first country really with the Second Empire.
Yes.
And that, however, is, they self-destruct in 1870. But before that, with the crisis of 1866, you already see that the French might be the inheritors of British supremacy, even in the international monetary field. Because the British had a terrible time in 1866.
Yeah.
There was open defiance by some upstart of the Bank of England. They went and withdrew money from the Bank of England, enormous sum of money, to say we want to destroy you, sort of. They weren't destroyed; they destroyed themselves. The challengers. So it was full of uncertainty, and even with criminal prosecutions, which is quite unusual in England.
So rare in banking as to be all. I mean,
yeah, but in England especially, with some people who were, because it was a criminal offense. It was a complex story. But 1866 was a period of really low for the, say, British monetary power. And then it was the beginning of another cycle when the British again tried to be at the top, especially because the French had to pay their indemnity. War indemnity, having lost.
Now, let me just raise a question. This is, after all, we can actually talk as well as and I mean, most histories of the Second Empire tend to treat the last 5 or 6 years of it as a gathering crisis. I mean, they point, to the Mexican disaster, to the way these almost meaningless elections were nevertheless being lost by the imperial friends, and the disappearance of, the Duc de Mornay and all these other folks who were said to be at least the brains behind Napoleon III. I mean, the suggestion that the British were losing their supremacy is a very interesting one, but I'm curious how you'd fit it into for most everybody else in the historiography, that part of the Second Empire scene is itself going down. So I'm talked, if you can, we can always edit this out. Talk to me about how two powers appear to be going down simultaneously, with one of them coming up relatively.
Yes, it's interesting because it might be true that the thing based on a personal, say, monarchy, with all the problems of succession and all that, we won't go into that at all. but it was a personal monarchy like the first.
Yeah. Well, he was
Empire.
actually buying. My memory is Napoleon III was buying that tomb in England just in case
Just in
that
case.
he eventually did use. You know.
And so this was a very, say, strange way of organizing politics, even in France.
Yeah.
And it was not long-lived by definition. So that is true. But it is also true that from the point of view of finance, the French were coming up. For instance, they were completely behind the unification and the first construction of the Italian economy.
Ah, yes. Okay.
But that's important. because
I talk some more, please, because we can't usually fish this out of histories. It may be in the Italian history somewhere. It rarely turns up in the global financial histories.
Yes, because after all, it involved only three countries, which is Italy, France, and a distant second, Great Britain. Because the British were interested more in lending to countries like Latin America and to private.
Well, what happened? My memory, you correct me, you know this history better than I do, is that it was a British merchant bank that was originally working with Count Cavour.
Mm-hmm.
What happened then?
What happened then is that Count Cavour split his
I see.
loyalties because he didn't want these people in Lombard Street to be the only ones.
Right.
And he turned also because the French turned to him, saying, we're helping you, not the
Yeah.
British fighting for you in the Po
Right.
Valley.
It's true. Yeah.
We are fighting,
Yeah.
and we're winning for you. And then we have finance to help you build the kingdom. And they carried on doing that, lending to the crown, lending to the country after the unification. The British weren't particularly interested in it any longer, and the French did all the deals.
Is that true in southern Italy?
You know, it's true everywhere.
Okay.
It is unification.
Okay. No.
After unification.
Yeah.
No, because before unification, you have an interesting situation in which Piedmont, which is the active part unifying the country,
Right.
very small, however, conquering the south, which was much bigger than they were. So they bet and they won a lot, as it were. They, in order to do so, got up to here in debt, as you do when you have these
that happens.
policies. The other ones were having a fantastic, like Portugal under the dictator, Salazar. Very balanced budgets, very little debt, and well administered.
And not
by
much
the
growth
British.
either, but that's
And no growth.
yeah.
And in fact, no arms, nothing.
Right.
So they were conquered, and lo and behold, what happens? Unification of the debt,
Yes. Okay.
which is what we are trying to do to the Germans now. But they don't seem to want to do it very much. And at the time, however, it was one country conquered
Right.
by arms. They won all over the place, and anyway, the Southerners, the bourgeoisie were in favor of the newcomers. Then there was the Garibaldi having conquered the thing. And so it was mandated that the various public debts be united, which meant throwing the weight of the Piedmontese debt on everybody, including these people, including Lombardy when it was finally annexed. Because Lombardy was very rich and not very indebted, because the debt was It's interesting thing that the Austrians, when they went away, didn't say, well, a portion of this our debt goes to Lombardy, as the Yugoslavs did when they split. No, they lost and they went home. more or less. And so the debt, they took the debt with them. Also because they had been rather good to Lombardy, not excessively, but Lombardy had been the most, modern active part of the empire with the Czech Republic, with what is now the Czech Republic. And so they weren't allowing them to do as much as they wanted, but that was definitely not a question. In effect, I never thought about it. It occurred to me now that this wasn't an issue.
No.
Yeah, they were defeated. They went home.
If you lose a war, it's
They
a
think
problem.
that we have been defeated by the French.
Yes. All right, maybe we could. So, look, in 1870, everybody knows the French lose to the Germans, or rather to Prussia, and then you end up with Germany coming out of that successive stages of consolidation there. How does the rise of Germany change the gold standard?
That's an important, very important point, because it is mentioned in all the treatments of this subject. The Germans go on to the gold standard. They adopt the gold standard. Why do they do it? It's interesting. The official story, which you find everywhere, is that they wanted to be a first-rate country. In other words, the first-rate countries have a gold base, and we shall have a gold base, like Britain. There is another story that they had to develop. They were already a serious country enough to defeat the French. But they were also interested, like the United States, in investing more than they saved. And so, if you went on to the gold standard, then you had the similarity, equal standard with the people, i.e. the British, who were going to invest. So they were favoring foreign investment, equal British investment, by that policy. And it was the reason why the Italians adopted the gold standard themselves, which was absolutely ruinous because they had to abandon it after a while. But again, it was a question saying, you want foreign money, you adopt the gold standard.
Okay, now how about the dynamics inside the large countries in this growing instability?
Well, it depends, yes, it depends on where you are. For instance, when you want to see the monetary standard adopted by, say, a country in South America that exports, and it exports either mineral products or agricultural products, then you will find that they are interested in a standard which will favor exports of these things, in the sense that the people who export will get more money when they change it from the good money they get from abroad, say British money, for having exported, into the local money to pay the workers. So that's how it works. It favors the classes that are putting in the investments or exploiting the export industries. And it is done, they adopt a standard which is usually devaluing, low, not very good.
Is that silver mostly?
Silver, when it becomes a binomial silver-gold, and that's another strand in this story, because the people who run these countries are interested in weak currencies for the reasons of maximizing exports and maximizing exports proceeds when they change them into local currency. Now, you can see that we are not interested in the same thing. Neither the Germans, it's interesting because they obviously think that they can maximize exports even with a very good standard.
That's right. It looks like a combination of a hard currency and technological change that gives them good exports. If that sounds familiar, it's because
that's the other element in German development. Yeah. The invention of, say, organized technology. The invention of the PhD, for instance.
Yes, that a little harder for me to swallow, but that's okay. I understand. Or lots of Americans trekked to Germany for the PhD in that period.
Yeah, but in that period, the whole world.
Yes.
If you read Indian novels, one of them in particular, there is an uncle who goes to study in Germany exactly in that period. Well, that was the country that was the leader in technology. And the PhD is done exactly to link theoretical science to practical science. But practical science as practiced in huge companies that are technologically, say, inventive and technologically relevant and up already at a certain level. To facilitate, there is this trade union, which is the doctorate. And the doctorate is done in a way that then will be transported to the United States after the first, well, in the 1930s.
Yeah.
For the well-known facts that we know about.
Yeah. Okay.
So the other strand, as you were saying, is silver against gold.
Yeah.
And these are the two, say, metals that have been used as long as we have had currencies that were metallic. But then even when the metal was not as important in the whole money supply, but it became one part of the money supply, the whole idea of the standard, the metallic standard, or bimetallic, or gold, or silver, is that you have a superstructure of, as it were, paper, or non, say, banking transactions built on a base which is made of either gold or silver. And I remember telling a great French historian about the gold and silver they were discussing, and he said I said French had the silver standard, and he said it was a pis-aller, in the sense that better than what had happened during the revolution. The assignat, paper, straight paper based on so-called wealth of the kingdom. But
actually, I think it started out at least as the church lands.
Yeah, that is always the beginning of everything, including the kingdom.
Yes, I think that's secularism.
Well, first of all, you take all the, and also of the British kingdom.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you take away the man of mort, as it was called, and then you build on that. You sell it. But then there is, however, the problem of which standard do you use, silver or gold? You have to base it on something, and then bimetallic. Now, bimetallism, they say it's eminently, inherently, technically unstable. A certain gentleman called Walras, whom some people might have heard of, proved a long time ago, because he was an engineer, he knew how to prove these things, that it wasn't true, provided that you had an oscillating price. So you could have a stable system which was based on a bimetallic standard. But
people didn't, in fact, keep them, though, right? I mean, or
no, because they said if you have a bimetallic standard, since the rate of production of the two metals is different, and also the desirability of the two metals is different, then you will find that their prices oscillate. What they should have added is that you cannot have a bimetallic standard at a fixed price of the two metals, which is true. Not even Walras proved that was stable. But once you make them oscillate, it is possible. Question is then, but this thing that oscillates all the time internally, you have a price of gold in terms of silver changing very frequently, doesn't give you a very good standard. You want to have certainty, at least inside your country. And that might be an argument, but certainly it is the argument for which countries tend to want to go to one standard, except the French, but that's a complex story, a complicated story.
Well, in the U.S. case,
and the U.S. as well,
was the hugely contested though our folks kept trying to fix the price, then getting blown off, and then people coming back and adding.
Well, in the case of the U.S., we have the discourse I was using before about South American, developing countries in the same way. That is to say, a part of the population of the United States, that is the agricultural people, were strongly in debt. And this is something completely different from what you have back in Europe. In Europe, they might be indebted, these surviving peasants. But in America, they were up-and-coming farmers who were in debt.
In the South, I'd call them more down-and-coming farmers in the sense that the sharecropping system.
Well, that is a third story. The second story is up-and-coming farmers were getting their land from the state. No?
Yep.
And then they had to buy agricultural machinery because it was always a capital-intensive operation in the United States agriculture. Yep. Then you had this other country, which is the south of the United States, where the sharecroppers, blacks, all sorts of different things, which we tend to ignore, although it was a very important
there's a lot of U.S. history, including some really brilliant
Civil War, you know.
Yes. Well,
you don't understand Civil War unless you understand that the South was exporting to Britain.
Yes.
It was a British colony.
Yep.
It had become, or it always was.
But it's also why Lincoln made John Murray Forbes his special representative, and Forbes was, I think, the largest single person presiding over British investment in the United States.
Yeah, there you are. So the story then is that these American farmers who have a problem, they vote and they elect. And then they have to be pandered to, of course.
For a while. That ended in the 1890s, the voting.
However, they want two things. Yeah. They want the strong currency to sow and a weak currency to reap, in other words. And they want a strong currency to repay their debts. So it's a rather complicated but definitely self-contradictory problem, which the politicians have to solve.
Yeah,
and that explains all the vagaries.
Yeah, in the end, in the United States, it's pretty clear the majority of the population in the South and the West wanted silver, for at least for a good long while, and the core of the North and the Midwestern banking community wanted gold. And in 1896, McKinley's victory settled that pretty much.
But that's more or less the end of the story.
Yeah.
But the beginning of the story, that is to say, before 96, the Americans are the one unbalancing element in the story of the international monetary
Let's
system.
pursue that a little bit, because we're going to, later in this interview, we'll come back to the American unbalancing role many times.
Well, it's a very dynamic economy.
Yeah.
When you have a population increasing as it did, for people who they don't produce children, it's the people who come already produced, already brought up, already educated, little but educated. Then you have a thing that never happened before. Because of course Latin America was doing the same, but they weren't at all doing the same, because they were divided into all sorts of countries, and then they weren't really so dynamic, with the exception maybe later on of Argentina for a while. But the United States was that all the time. When in Italy you call the United States, you call it America, you don't call it the United States. America is the United States. The others are called with their names. When you say, I'm going to America, it means you're going to the United States. And it has meant that for 100 years or even more. So when you have that that's naturally unbalancing, because if you're so dynamic, how can you be a balancing element on the rest of the world? It's difficult to be.
Yeah, so what specifically,
Now, there is one, however, thing that applies to what we're talking about. That is to say that they caused, the Americans with their peculiar economy, something called the autumn drain in London, in Europe. What happens is that crops are, cultivated, and then they are reaped. The time they are reaped, it's summer. Then they have to be bought, shipped, and paid for. And the money has to come from New York. But New York is always using more money than it has, so it has to fetch it, as it were, from Britain. And therefore, there is every year an autumn drain when the money goes from England, puts up the interest rate there because it is going away from England to the United States, well, even from the rest of Europe. And then in the United States it's going to New York, where these strange large banks are. And then it has to spread to all the banks, because America, among other strange things, has the largest banks in the world by the end of the period, but even for a long part of the period, and the smallest. It has an enormous number of banks, 40,000, 100,000 country member, huge number, each little town having the bank. Why? Because the bank is to make money, to invent credit. And so, to pay the farmers, it has to spread everywhere from New York. And so it goes finally there, causes the autumn drain in England, and then replenishes the cash, the farmers. The farmers then have to spend it. But it takes them some time to spend it, so they have to bring it to the market, this money, and buy goods. And another season begins, buying the seeds, but also buying everything for the house, buying the machinery. And farming in the United States is progressive and extremely capital intensive, and an export industry. That these three elements prevail up to a point for a long time. And now I don't know, because you know these things, whether the three characteristics are still there. They're progressive, probably from the point of view of technical progress, it is true, still true. The interesting thing is the Americans are exporting farming machinery of the most modern kind, which they have themselves invented very early on.
Yeah.
In the 19th century.
Cyrus McCormick was making it before the Civil War.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, but they are, even I saw an American old piece of machinery in my hometown in the south of Italy. So it was there historically, as it were, but somebody had actually imported it because it was the most modern you could have. So that's another element in this strange country, which starts grown up. Everybody has, the idea of the infancy. Well, the Americans were never infants, because the people came when they were already grown-ups. They didn't have to change from being peasants, which could be infancy, into being industrial, it would be grown-ups in another configuration. No, they were always grown-ups, bigger and bigger and bigger grown-ups, with money and technology for a bit, and people coming from the other side and causing problems to the others, especially.
Yeah. Now, so especially in the last 10 years before World War I, how do you sort of want to break down the elements causing instability? There's, on the one hand, growing mistrust among the large countries, and as you say, a shift toward a more pure gold standard as a result. There is also these frequent crises that grow up.
And then, for instance, there is 1907 crisis.
Yeah.
That's an American product. The first, there were others in the 30s, in
my
39.
memory is in the 19th century we could export a lot of things, and one of them was financial crises from time to
Yes, you were
time.
exporting them to London all the time, because you were a republic and that won a war of independence, but they ran you. And it is not true that they run you today, as you will see on the internet if you open any number.
There you see a lot of strange things on the internet.
There are millions of entries about the British conspiracy, which makes me really laugh. But at the time, it was true. It has remained as a myth because it once was true, but for much longer than you care to admit in official histories. Because it is a question people don't want to talk about very much. However, the thing is that the unbalancing then was the American economy still growing apace and having things like the crisis of 1907. And then there is another unbalancing for the Indians, but balancing for the system item, which is the role of India.
Yeah, we need to, this was perhaps the most, especially in Britain and in India, the most controversial part of your book. So we should probably walk through that argument a bit.
That I find extremely interesting from the point of view of seeing how things linger on. That it was taken up, as you say, as a controversial point in England, as you can imagine, about my book. Indian reactions, none. Because they ignored, because they've been told that this wasn't a thing.
Now we better spell out for the people watching this
what it is.
What it is.
Now, what it is that in the years before the First World War, the Indian economy became an export economy. An export economy which it did probably not have a vocation for. In other words, it did it before its time because the British imposed a type of cultivations, because it's all agricultural exports, that were good for the international market, but probably did not cause much food to be on the tables, as it were, of many Indians at the time. It wasn't, they should have concentrated on being self-sufficient in food, and that was all, as they did after independence. But they were an export economy. And the interesting thing is that the surplus that they caused, and that they obtained, was all used in various ways by British elements, British institutions. Either it was deposited, held in British consuls, in British,
consuls or bonds, British
bonds,
perpetual bonds,
or other sorts of public bonds, especially after the Boer War caused Britain to swing into public deficit. And it was the end of Victorian so-called public deficit balanced budgets. But then they partly solved it by telling the Indians to deposit, to buy British bonds, or by investing it in other British financial titles of various sorts, and very little was used by actual India. It was all in India's name. There were no swindles, of course. The British government of India was titular of all these, a title over all these various investments. But they managed to get demand for British financial paper,
assets,
when it was necessary to have it, and it was captive. The Indians had very little say.
Yeah, effectively the claim is the Indian surplus is used as the balancing item for the British when they're short.
Exactly, when they have another
I'm just
gain.
formulating this for our viewers.
So they want to keep financial domination over the United States by furnishing, supplying gold and investing. You know, when the British disinvested in America, it was found that they owned most of the United States still,
Right.
First World War.
It's notorious that almost all the cowboys were working for British land companies.
The railways,
Cattle
everything,
companies.
you know,
Yeah.
it was well known. So when they did, the Americans told them to sell the investments and pay for the supplies they
This
were
is
getting.
actually
in the First
something we
World
want to
War.
get into a bit. This you're speaking now during really World War I.
Yes,
Yeah,
that
right.
is
Yeah.
after 1914.
Yeah.
But before that, it was solved, among other things, by the Indian surplus being wisely invested in England. And you could say, agree, that these were wise investments. Only, did they really need to invest, or would they perhaps have been better off buying things to develop the country in India? That is the question. And also, the government of India was not Indian.
Right.
It
There
was
is
the
this-
British government of India. And as a British economist told me 50 years ago, the whole, say, military budget of the empire was on the government of India budget. So if there were the African rifles and the African troubles,
Gurkhas.
all
Yeah.
paid for by the government of India budget. So it was really the jewel in the crown. And so this was balancing,
Yeah.
the main balancing item. And the main unbalancing item was the behavior of the United States. Both of them for political reasons. One, because it was independent, but dependent on British money, because it invested more than saved. The other one, because it could not invest what it saved. The Indians could not invest what they saved wisely for their own development. They invested wisely because actually their investments were the safest in the world, because people from all over the world were investing wisely in the City of London. So that was the usual answer. These are good investments. What do you want? But the question is, what should they have been invested, or should they have been used to foment, as we say, development, more growth in India
Yeah, there were certainly other countries that did other things and developed
with
at
their
that
money?
point,
Yeah.
and with sort of sometimes national programs, everything
So
from
the
tariff-
interesting elements of the whole story are that when the Germans move to a high standard, a revalued standard, the gold standard,
Yep.
that is not bad after a while. Because there is, as you know, a post-unification crisis in Germany with a boom and a bust
Yeah,
and
a
all sorts of
long
things.
disaster. Yeah,
long
it lasted
disaster.
for
I
quite
remember with the usual question that they should have not, they should have let the French win. You know, somebody, I don't know who was, that said at that time, Bismarck probably. I don't think it's true, but it is attributed. If I had known what would come, I would have let them win. So, because the French were doing well, as it were, as they always do, after defeat. Because also when Ricardo had gone over to come to Italy, France, after the Napoleonic Wars, they said, my God, these people are extremely well off, and we have won, and we are in a usual post-victory trouble, which happens in England.
No.
And they had a bad time. He went through France, and France was thriving, having lost the war. But the real, another interesting element of this story is that when the French pay the indemnity, it goes to Germany.
Right.
But the people who make money are the City of London
Right.
and the Rothschild. If you read Bouvier's book on the Rothschild, you will find that spelled out
Yeah.
beautifully, as it was customary with that great French monetary historian. And because all the money went through London.
Yep.
Because it were assets that had to be transformed into cash and
Yep.
sent to Germany.
Okay, so
And the
you're
Germans withdrew, as you know, 1 mile. They had, had linked the arrival of indemnity and the withdrawal of the troops to Germany. It's an
yes.
interesting story.
What do we want to say about the actual arrival of the war itself and the crisis that sort of ended this system?
Well, I definitely would not go as far as saying that the financial system breakdown, which occurred the minute after the declaration of war, might even say even before, immediately before, caused the war. It's not true.
No, it didn't.
Patently
It was,
not true.
No, that's ridiculous.
However, then I would not say that what caused the war was the race to more and more gold accumulation.
Yeah.
That just caused problems.
Right.
And it caused probably, say, a dilution of the cycle.
No, look, I think we've all read Fritz Fischer, and there are plenty of other people who have theories about how this plays. I don't think anyone...
I don't want to, but I just, for what
Yeah.
I know,
Yeah.
I never would go as far as
Yeah.
saying that it was monetary
Yeah.
and financial reason that caused the war. Economic reasons maybe, but we might discuss it, but I don't think
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing, however, is that the world has become so interconnected, as the man who wrote The Great Illusion said, that he said,
That's Angel. Yeah.
yes, Norman Angel, he said this will prevent war. Economics has become so intertwined that economies have become so intertwined that the war will not be possible. At the beginning it looked like that, because when the war was declared, even when the Archduke was shot, the financial system stopped all over the world. But then it started again. But it did stop. And as usual, it was the Americans who stopped it. Why? Because they had
think
to
it's
send the money every day.
Perfectly obvious why.
They had to pay.
Yeah.
And they declared a moratorium.
Yeah.
And after which the British said, we'll have to declare a moratorium too. We don't run this system anymore. It is they who run it. And they decided for any reason, because there was absolute expectation of upheaval in New York, because New York was owing enormous amounts of money. And it would be withdrawn from there to be spent in the war. And so they expected, and they said, we can't destroy, we're going to be neutral. We can't destroy this country to pay back. We shall pay back in due course, and in order not to destroy the normal going on of things, we declare a moratorium. And the British said, well, at this point, I have in that book, you mentioned a last part in which I reproduce the minutes of the meetings that Lloyd George was having in London with the financial
Bankers.
powers of the city. And they're trying to get some sort of agreement among them to do things. And there it was clear that that was happening. What was happening in the United States was of utmost importance and relevance. It was the greatest concentration of investment, short term. Because long term, everybody knew it. But short term, they were huge. And they also had become short-term investments in London by America, by American firms. So it was intertwined. But generally speaking, the American, financial circles told the politicians that maybe it's better to immediately stop the flow.
Marcello, after World War I, there is an enormous literature on central bank cooperation. But that begs the question of what was central bank cooperation like before World War I, on which, of course, there is a literature. But how would you characterize that?
Well, central bank cooperation before the First World War was eminently a relationship between France and Britain, and the others coming in every now and then. Why? Because of historical reasons, and because of the House of Rothschild having one house in Paris and one house in London. And this is important, because one controlled the silver standard and the other one controlled the gold standard. That is to say, they were very influential in shaping the way things went. And the fact that they controlled these two markets was facilitating things from their point of view and from a certain point of view of the world. For instance, and there has been some research done by a former student of mine on alternative views of how a monetary standard should be, with the Rothschild, who control the actual flows of the metals, insisting on keeping metallic standards, strangely enough, and Goldschmidt, who became goldsmith in England, wanting to do, having the contrary view that maybe having, say, a credit standard, banking was more important than having direct exchanges of pieces of metal. So you have alternative views. The story is interesting in itself, but you can see that as far as central bank cooperation goes, people can say, look, but there were all these monetary conferences before the First World War. It's true. There were several international monetary conferences called by chiefs of state and to discuss the standard, the question of the standard. Because it's interesting, because it's a fashion of the time, because you have a standard question in every field. You have the standard of railway gauges. You have the standard of everybody tries to unite, l'Union Postale Universelle. And then you have other attempts to unite the world, because the technology is leading that way. And of course, they try to do it with money. So you start talking about an international money, or at least a money which will be national, but everybody has the same standards. So the weights and fineness of the metals and exchange rates between coins, how do they stand in relation to one another, and so on. And in order to further this, they call these international conferences. Well, they get together and then everybody goes home. And the British always say, as they do even today, yes, but we reserve our judgment. We're going to do the hell we want, in other words. And the Americans try, well, I don't think we can configure a unitarian view of what they do.
No,
it depends on...
No central bank.
Exactly.
And much of the agitation in the international conference was definitely to placate diehard advocates of silver, where you'd say, we'll talk about this.
And then the cracks of iron, of gold, and all that. But then it becomes a question of frequent exchanges between the Bank of England and the Bank of France. And strangely enough, there is a Rothschild, a director of the Bank of France, and another Rothschild, director of the Bank of England. Each of them very patriotic, of course, and normal people, but so it is. So the special relationship is there all the time, and it is important because when one has to remember that the British run the international monetary system on a very tiny amount of gold they actually owned by the Bank of England. Because for the Bank of England, owning gold, the gold reserve, was a cost.
Right.
It yielded nothing.
Didn't pay anything. Yeah.
So they
And the Bank of England is privately
The
owned.
Bank
a
of
point
England
which, as you
was
and I
private.
both know, but
And many other central banks, several other central banks, were also created private because of the Bank of England. Banque de France was a very strange operation because private, created by Napoleon,
that's right.
and with the chief, how do you say, the governor appointed by the head of state. So it was the
Public-private partnership is what they'd be calling it today.
The continental capitalism way of doing things. But then the Bank of England was supposed to be also publicly minded, although that was not really, I don't think it was stated in pieces of paper, but it was understood. So they had this problem of making a balance, making a profit for their shareholders, and that meant that they had to minimize the gold reserves, but then keeping the whole dance going on of the international monetary system based on London, because London did not lose its importance as a international financial center until when they lost their investment capacity in the after the First World War. But up to the very end, although the other centers became important, London for the international affairs, economic affairs, financial affairs was still preeminent. And they had to run that whole show with 100 foreign banks having set up in London, therefore putting money into London and taking money out of London at their will, with a tiny, in comparative terms, gold reserve, and also with, as I said before, finding that the interest rate did not really function all that well when they most needed it to function well, because people were, as I said before, tending to keep their gold at home, the other central banks. Not only because of patriotic reasons, but why? If you had just started the gold standard, as many countries tried to before the First World War, then you did have the need to keep
We need some gold.
their gold reserve, because you had usually a legal percentage to respect. And so when it started going away, what did you have to do? You didn't really want to put up the interest rate, because one was the British putting up the interest rate and calling money from everywhere. And if you were Italy or another country like that and put up the interest rate, nobody paid the slightest attention. So it might be even counterproductive. Say, oh, they put up the interest rate, means they have no money, so let's get out of here. And, international short-term capital movements before the First World War did exist. They were nothing compared to what happened afterwards, but they did, everything began that then carried on after the First World War. It was not the world was broken and reconstructed. Yes, maybe politically, but the technology, you couldn't send it away, thank God. And the capacity to transfer by telegraph, by telephone, and so they also didn't go away. Why should it go away? Because there was a war that had been fought and won and lost. But so these things are permanent features. There is a continuum between the before and after. Now, because otherwise people think of a cleavage before and after being completely different. The word we have lost, you see, And Mr. Keynes describing the time when you would from your bed, as he did, order this, that, and the other from the four corners of the world without moving and so on, without traveling, without a passport, all true. And it became different, but you could still order things after the war. And, okay, so
How do things change with the war?
no, I want to say something before. So the cooperation was not all the time. There was a confidence of people knew each other in the Bank of England, the Bank of France. The Bank of England had to make the world move, as it were, on this tiny reserve, and it had invented the most gigantic financial superstructure the world had ever seen on this tiny bit of gold. And the people, and there were giant banks coming up all over the world before the First World War, and the Bank of England having to take notice of them because they were independent. They could not be influenced by the Bank of England.
Yeah.
And they went to the point of meeting these giant bankers, were very few, and saying, but this Bank of England, how can we rely on it? We have to have our own gold reserve.
Right.
And they started making plans for it. And some people, as you should say, but that was to help the Bank of England. The Bank of England did not take that view.
No.